I've given my comments this morning the title, Making the Sacred Profane or Worse. And I can provide no better illustration of what I'm getting at than to describe for you a short film that I saw last week, a film I saw for the very first time, and if I had anything to say about it, the very last time. The film begins with two very thin, very dead women in lingerie, slowly swinging back and forth from the ceiling by hanging by chains that are around their necks. In the middle of this is a large black man in a large leather chair, very much alive and smoking a cigarette. The next scene, maybe 10 seconds later, two other dead young white women in corsets and leather are slumped on a silk-sheeted bed while a black man advances from the side. His intentions quite clear. The next scene, a few seconds later, shows another woman, also in sexualized lingerie, spread eagle on a huge, ornate dining table in front of a man who is eating a plate of raw meat. Cut back now to the bed. This time, the black man is on the bed with the two young, dead white women, and he shows no hesitation as he moves the lifeless arm of one onto the lifeless leg of the other before cupping the porcelain-like face of the first dead woman to kiss her. The rest of this short film is a sort of a mini horror movie, with all the horror being suffered by women. It is graphic and gendered violence. It does not depict random corpses. It depicts sexualized female corpses. The backgrounds in the rooms, every scene, are in some large and opulent mansion, and nowhere is there any sign that any struggle took place. Everything is neat and tidy, implying that the women either died willingly, or maybe they were just sort of always there, like the furniture or something. And the message is crystal clear. It is not women in the video that are a turn on, not actual women per se, but only their utterly silent, utterly passive, highly sexualized, and very, very skinny bodies. In that state, they are playthings for the men. Far from being horrified by the passivity and the death, the men appear to like it. It appears to turn them on. Now, you might think that what I am describing comes from the far reaches of torture pornography or snuff films, which are apparently a real thing, in which men actually murder women before abusing their corpses on film. But this was not that. What I just described to you was the video teaser for a single by Kanye West, with contributions from Nicki Minaj and Jay-Z. The single is called Monster. Now, if you don't follow rap music or pop culture, you might not recognize the names I just mentioned, but you should know that Kanye West and Nicki Minaj and Jay-Z are not offbeat wannabes who are trying to get attention by being outrageous. They are superstars. They are the very epitome of pop culture. They are the top of the top, and tens of millions of young people have already seen and digested this video. I don't know what that is. The album of which this single is a part is called, get this, the album is called My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. This album won the Grammy Award of Best Rap Album of the Year in 2010. And I hold this up only because, to me at least, this just begins to point at what I'm getting at with my title, Making the Sacred Profane. Because there is nothing, and I mean nothing, in my opinion, that is beautiful about Kanye West's dark and twisted fantasy. And to use the word beautiful, evoking beauty, transcendence, wholeness, connection, in the context of the dark, twisted, cruel, and insulting imagery of that video does, in fact, seem to me an effort to make the sacred profane. The definition of profane, by the way, is to treat something holy with great disrespect. But this is not a sermon about pop culture or music videos. This is a sermon about sexual violence. The very real experience of far too many people that is held up and supported and aided and abetted by a social and cultural construction that all of us are a part of and that affects every one of us. The social and cultural construction has and continues to cause unfathomable damage and is diametrically opposite to the ideals that we stand for as people of faith. Videos like the one I described just give us a window, some images, some symbols into the deeper issues of our culture and our place within that culture. I should tell you what inspired me to speak to this today. It came from a discussion that happened in the Our Whole Lives sexuality class that happened here at First Unitarian last fall. Sally Isaacson was a part of that class and facilitated a discussion about the association of sexuality with violence. And she made the statement that sexual violence separates both the victim and the perpetrator from their spiritual center. That was the phrase that caught my attention. And that's the idea that I set out to explore this morning. I'm not sure if I've been entirely successful, but that's what I set out to do. Making the sacred profane, or worse, is what I believe happens when violence or the threat of violence enters a sexual relationship. Those statistics are outrageous. And I mean that word in the original sense of the word, as in moral outrage. Moral outrage is exactly what we should feel when we learn that 1 out of every 3 women in the United States will experience sexual violence in her lifetime. That is a staggering, outrageous statistic. 1 out of every 3. 1 in 4 women have survived rape or attempted rape. 25% of every woman in America. Outrageous. Of those survivors, 2/3 knew the person who raped or attempted to rape her. 40% of those rapists were friends or acquaintances. 30% were boyfriends, husbands, or ex-boyfriends or ex-husbands. Just under 10% were family members. In my own life, 2 out of my 3 sisters, my wife, probably half the women I've ever dated, numerous women and several men in this congregation have shared with me that they have been victims of rape. 40% of rapes occur in the victim's own home. The most common effects of sexual violence are depression, trouble sleeping, an inability to concentrate, contemplating or attempting suicide, flashbacks, dissociation, self-blame, and intense stress on other intimate relationships. How about this statistic? 97% of rapists never spend a day in jail. 97%. I've learned a lot in getting ready to speak on this subject today. And I got to share with you that learning about sexual violence is unfortunately a lot like setting about to learn about racism or the justice system or immigration or some other choice topics. The more you learn about sexual violence, the more you simply have to realize that no matter how bad you think it is, it's far, far worse than you think it is. Millions of heartbreaking stories. Like Daisy Coleman of Missouri, who was 14 when a 17-year-old high school senior gave her alcohol, raped her, and left her unconscious body on the doorstep of her family's home. Turned out this young man was the grandson of a state representative in Missouri, and in the weeks that followed this, the prosecutor quietly dropped charges against the young man without telling the family. Evidence was mysteriously lost, and when the family went public, the harassment started. Daisy had to drop out of school. Her mother was fired from her job. The family moved 80 miles away to try and make a new start, and shortly after that move, their house was burned to the ground. Or the story of the successful suburban businesswoman whose abusive husband regularly beat her, raped her, controlled every move she made, who poured hot coffee grounds over her head on the morning she was going out to a job interview. And looking back on it years later, she said she never once thought of herself as an abused woman. Not once, not ever. She thought of herself as a strong woman. A strong woman with a troubled man, and she the only one in the world who understood him and could help him. Or the story of many of the boys who were molested by Catholic priests, one of whom wrote that even now as a 50-year-old man has never, ever been able to have an intimate, trusting relationship with another human being. Or how about one of the detectives assigned to investigate pedophilia in the Catholic Church was himself arrested for possessing over 4,000 images of child pornography. Or the dozens of stories I found where sexually abused women, girls, and boys went to their priests or pastors for support or sanctuary, and instead of support were told that it was God's will. And Jesus would love them more if they would just bear their suffering in the way that Jesus bore his suffering. Or one of the newest recognized categories of sexual violence, intimate partner sexual abuse, or IPSV. That's when the rapist is your husband or live-in boyfriend. And the rapes take place almost daily, and your rapist is also the father of your children, the one you eat dinner with every night, the ones your friends tell you you're so lucky to be married to because they're such a good provider and a loving father. And over time you come to distrust your own conflicted feelings, and you learn to distrust your own mind, and over time your sense of self and identity erode to a distant memory. And on and on and on. From international sex trafficking in girls and in boys, to the use of rape as terrorism, to the stories of how some women, I've heard this recently, when they go to a bar, they have learned to never ever set down their drink without having their hand over the top of the glass for fear that someone will slip a date rape drug into it. Unlike a generation or two ago, there are wonderful resources out there right now for anyone who wants to learn or find a name for what you are experiencing or have experienced, or find support or make a plan or just get help. But I want to come back to this idea that sexual violence separates both victim and perpetrator from their spiritual center. In this spiritual tradition, we affirm that deep within all of us is the potential for wholeness and great love. Every one of us. And I believe we struggle to tap into that place because all of us get separated from our spiritual center. The culture we have created and which we perpetuate ensures that we remain separated from our spiritual center. Whether it's the mixed messages of sexuality that both genders received from their earliest days on earth, or the violence that is deeply embedded in our language and mental imagery. That could be a whole sermon by itself, by the way. You know, like banging the chicks, hitting on the girls, getting nailed. She's a bombshell, and so on, and so on, and so on. We are all pushed and socially coerced into gender and identity boxes that are not our highest selves. For men, masculine sexuality is taught and assumed to involve the oppression of women, competition with other men, and homophobia, just as a beginning. We know that rape and sexual violence is much more about power than it is about sex. And despite clear and powerful advances, patriarchy remains still more powerful. I am talking here about the systematic domination of women through social rewards, social punishments, unequal opportunities, and the internalization of unequal expectations through gender and sex roles. All of us, men and women, have our inherent worth and dignity warped by this cultural, economic, and politically gendered and sexualized system. Here is one of my central theses as we begin this month where we are considering evil as our whole soul living theme. I do not believe that people are basically evil. But the potential for evil lies in every single human heart, every single human soul, every single human being. I also believe, both theologically and from my own depth experience of life and of loving, that the wider the gap becomes between our public selves and our spiritual center, the higher are the odds that evil will emerge. Another way of saying that is that evil, I believe, becomes possible when our inner selves, our inner lives, get divided into compartments that don't talk to each other. I mentioned last week, we know for a fact that torturers and the guards at Nazi concentration camps and the guys who dropped the napalm onto Vietnamese villages had families at home and loved their children and think of themselves as good parents and good providers. I believe we are a whole culture separated from our spiritual center, and into that gap between the illusion of separateness and the deeper truth of the inherent sacredness and worth of every single soul, into that gap is where evil arises. That gap is where sexual violence originates. And sexual violence is one of the ways that gap is made wider still in a self-reinforcing cycle of power and of pain, because pain that is not transformed is transmitted. Which is why we talk about this stuff in church. Because talking about it doesn't fix it, but it raises the odds of transforming the pain so that we might lower the odds of transmitting the pain. Which brings me back to that video that I began with, and the question it raises for many of us who are trying to raise our sons and daughters in a world where it is simply not possible, I assure you, to shield them from that kind of message. Here's what I teach my own sons, and I'm going to close with this thought. I teach my sons, despite anything you see or anything you hear, there is nothing sexy about violence. There is nothing sexy about violence. And there is nothing sexy about having power over people. Nothing whatsoever. Having power over people is ultimately hollow and unfulfilling. Want to know what's sexy? Want to know what's really sexy? What is unbelievably, inarguably, bubbling, slippery, cauldron hot sexy? Consent. Loving, happy, enthusiastic, participatory, joyful consent. It does not get any sexier than that. And we need to know this because something so ravenous, sweaty, sweet, passionate, loud, and sexy without consent is rape. Amen.
Please stand for and join us singing in the teal hymnal, number 1026 of Every Woman in the World. We'll sing verses 1, 2, and 4.
Sweet dream of how can you